What happens when the place designed to nurture young minds becomes a breeding ground for something that feeds on innocence itself? How many teachers have noticed that certain students never seem to age quite right, or that the class photos from decades ago show faces that still walk the hallways today? When children whisper about the room that doesn't appear on any floor plan, or the teacher who only appears during specific lessons, do we dismiss it as imagination, or do we consider that schools, buildings filled with the emotional energy of thousands of young souls, might attract things that have learned to hide in plain sight among the finger paintings and multiplication tables? In the American education system, where we trust our most precious resource to institutions we assume are safe, some schools have secrets that would make parents pull their children out immediately if they only knew what really happens after the final bell rings. Rachel Foster had been teaching 5th grade at Millbrook Elementary School in rural Vermont for 15 years when she first noticed that something was fundamentally wrong with the building's east wing. Not wrong in an obvious way that could be reported to maintenance or the school board, but wrong in a subtle, creeping manner that made her question her own perception and memory. The east wing contained 6 classrooms, a storage area, and what the architectural plans labeled as a multi-purpose room that Rachel had never seen anyone actually use for any purpose whatsoever. The wrongness manifested in small ways at first. Rachel would walk down the east wing hallway during her planning period and find that the distance between her classroom and the multi-purpose room seemed to vary depending on time of day and her state of mind. Sometimes the walk took 30 seconds. Other times it stretched to nearly 5 minutes despite the hallway being the same physical length. The fluorescent lights in that corridor flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if something was communicating through the electrical system. Most disturbing were the sounds that emerged from the supposedly empty multi-purpose room. Rachel would hear what sounded like children's voices reciting lessons in unison, but when she pressed her ear against the door, the voices would stop immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply representing its absence. She tried the door handle multiple times, but it was always locked, and the main office claimed they had no key for that particular room. "That room hasn't been used since before I started here 23 years ago," Principal Margaret Whitmore explained when Rachel asked about accessing it. "The previous administration had it sealed after some kind of incident. The records aren't clear about what happened, but the decision was made to simply pretend the room doesn't exist, rather than deal with whatever problems it posed." The casual way Principal Whitmore discussed sealing off an entire room and pretending it didn't exist should have alarmed Rachel more than it did. But Millbrook Elementary had always had an atmosphere that discouraged too many questions, a culture where long-serving staff members learned to accept certain oddities as normal features of the school environment. Rachel had absorbed this culture over her 15 years, learning which topics were safe to discuss and which were better left unexamined. But Rachel's willingness to ignore the school's strangeness began to erode during the fall semester of 2019, when a new student named Thomas Brennan transferred into her 5th grade class. Thomas was unusual from his first day, not in ways that were immediately obvious to casual observation, but in subtle details that accumulated into a portrait of a child who didn't quite fit normal categories. His school records indicated he was 10 years old, but Thomas carried himself with a maturity that suggested much greater age and experience. He knew the answers to questions before Rachel asked them, not because he was particularly intelligent, but because he seemed to already know the exact curriculum she would be teaching. More unsettling still, other teachers began commenting that Thomas looked familiar, as if they had taught him before, though none could pinpoint when or in which grade. Rachel's concern about Thomas intensified when she discovered him in the East Wing hallway during lunch period, standing motionless in front of the locked multi-purpose room, with an expression that suggested he was listening to something only he could hear. When Rachel approached and asked what he was doing, Thomas turned to her with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 10-year-old child. "They're having class in there," Thomas said matter-of-factly, pointing at the sealed door. "The old lessons. The ones that taught things the new curriculum forgot." Rachel's training and instincts told her this was a child with an overactive imagination, possibly processing some trauma through fantasy narratives about secret lessons and hidden classrooms. But something in Thomas's tone and his absolute certainty made her wonder if he was perceiving something real that most people couldn't detect. "There's no one in that room," Rachel said gently, using the reassuring voice she employed with students who were frightened or confused. "It's been locked and empty for many years." Thomas shook his head with the patience of someone correcting a minor misunderstanding. "It's empty now because lunch period doesn't match their schedule. But during third period and right after school, there are always students in there. You can hear them if you listen the right way." Before Rachel could respond, Thomas walked away toward the cafeteria, leaving her standing alone in the hallway with questions that she didn't know how to answer or even properly formulate. She pressed her ear against the multi-purpose room door again, listening for the voices Thomas claimed to hear, but encountered only that same absorbing silence that seemed to pull sound into itself. Rachel's investigation into the multi-purpose room's history led her to the school's archives, boxes of old records stored in the basement that documented Millbrook Elementary's operations going back to its founding in 1952. She was looking for information about the incident that had led to the room being sealed, hoping to find some rational explanation that would ease her growing unease about the East Wing. What she discovered in those dusty boxes was a pattern of disappearances and strange occurrences centered around the multi-purpose room that stretched back decades. In 1967, 3 students had vanished during a standardized testing session held in that room, never to be found despite extensive searches. In 1978, a teacher named Helen Morrison had suffered a complete psychological breakdown after spending a semester using the multi-purpose room for remedial instruction, claiming that the room was teaching her students things she hadn't included in her lesson plans. The records from 1985 were the most disturbing, describing an incident where school administrators had discovered that a class of students had been attending lessons in the multi-purpose room taught by a teacher who didn't appear on any employment records. The unauthorized teacher had apparently been conducting sessions for weeks before being discovered, and when confronted had simply vanished, leaving behind students who couldn't or wouldn't explain who had been instructing them or what they had been learning. Each incident had been investigated, documented, and then apparently filed away and forgotten, with the school continuing to operate as if nothing unusual had occurred. The pattern suggested institutional denial on a massive scale, with successive administrations choosing to ignore mounting evidence of impossible events rather than confront realities that challenged normal understanding of how schools were supposed to function. Rachel found photographs in the archives that made her blood run cold. Class photos from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s showed students whose faces were eerily familiar, not similar in the way that family members might resemble each other across generations, but identical, as if the same children had been attending Millbrook Elementary for decades without aging. Some of those faces matched students currently enrolled in the school, including Thomas Brennan. The photograph from 1963 showed a boy who could have been Thomas's twin, standing in the front row of a 5th grade class photo with the same knowing expression that Rachel recognized from her current student. The nameplate beneath the photo identified him as Thomas Brennan, grade 5, Mrs. Patterson's class. Either this was an incredible coincidence involving a descendant with the same name and nearly identical appearance, or something impossible was happening at Millbrook Elementary. Rachel confronted Thomas the next day, showing him the 1963 photograph and asking for an explanation. Thomas studied the image for a long moment before responding with unsettling calm. "That's me," he said simply. "I've been a 5th grader at this school for a very long time. So have most of the other students in your class. We don't age the normal way because we're not learning normal lessons." The casual way Thomas discussed not aging normally should have been shocking, but Rachel found herself accepting the statement with less resistance than she would have expected. Working at Millbrook Elementary for 15 years had apparently prepared her consciousness for revelations that challenged basic assumptions about reality, even if she hadn't consciously recognized that preparation. "What kind of lessons are you learning?" Rachel asked, trying to understand the nature of what was happening to the students in her care. Thomas gestured toward the East Wing, toward the sealed multi-purpose room that had been the center of so many documented incidents. "The lessons that prepare us for what comes after ordinary life," he explained. The school exists in multiple states simultaneously, the version that parents and most teachers perceive, and the version where students like me learn things that can't be taught through normal curriculum. The revelation that Millbrook Elementary existed in multiple states, with some students attending lessons that most staff members couldn't perceive, transformed Rachel's understanding of her 15 years at the school. She had been teaching ordinary academic subjects to students who appeared to be normal children, while some of those same students were simultaneously receiving instruction in subjects and from teachers that existed outside her awareness. Rachel's discoveries about the school's true nature accelerated when she decided to observe the multi-purpose room during the times Thomas had mentioned, third period and right after school. She positioned herself in the hallway with a clear view of the sealed door, waiting to see if anything would confirm Thomas's claims about classes being held in the supposedly empty space. During third period on a Tuesday afternoon, Rachel watched as students began emerging from regular classrooms and walking toward the multi-purpose room, which now stood open despite having been locked moments earlier. The students moved with purpose and coordination, entering the room in an orderly line that suggested practiced routine rather than random movement. Rachel recognized several of them as current students from various grade levels, including Thomas and 3 other children from her own 5th grade class. Rachel followed the students to the multi-purpose room doorway and looked inside, seeing an impossible space that couldn't have existed within the school's physical structure. The room extended far beyond the exterior wall's limitations, containing row upon row of desks occupied by students of various ages, all facing a teacher who stood at the front of the class writing on a blackboard that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The teacher was difficult to focus on directly, her appearance shifting between different forms as if she existed in several states at once. Sometimes she looked like a conventional educator from the 1950s, other times like something that had learned to approximate human form but hadn't quite mastered the details. Her voice carried clearly through the impossible classroom, teaching lessons that Rachel's mind struggled to categorize or comprehend. The fundamental principle, the impossible teacher was saying as Rachel listened from the doorway, is that consciousness can be preserved beyond physical life if it's properly prepared during the formative years. You are learning to transcend the normal limitations of human existence to become something that can persist indefinitely by recycling through the school system in bodies that never fully mature. Rachel understood then what was happening to students like Thomas. They weren't simply attending additional classes. They were being transformed into entities that existed in a permanent state of childhood, recycling through elementary school endlessly, while learning to transcend normal human limitations. The school wasn't just an educational institution. It was a mechanism for creating a specific type of consciousness that could persist indefinitely without aging or dying. The implications were staggering. How many of Millbrook Elementary's students were actually ancient entities in child form, playing the role of ordinary kids while learning lessons that prepared them for existence beyond normal human categories? How long had this system been operating, and how many generations of students had been transformed by exposure to the impossible teacher and her curriculum? Rachel's shock at these revelations was interrupted when the impossible teacher noticed her presence in the doorway and turned to address her directly. "Mrs. Foster," the teacher said, and her voice had harmonics that suggested multiple entities speaking in unison. "We've been expecting you to discover our operations eventually. Your 15 years here have been preparing you for this moment." The suggestion that Rachel's entire tenure at Millbrook Elementary had been preparation for discovering the school's true nature made her reconsider every experience and decision that had brought her to this point. She had chosen this school because it offered stability and a supportive environment for developing teachers. She had stayed because the students seemed engaged and the community was welcoming, but apparently there had been other factors guiding her career path, invisible influences that had been shaping her journey toward this revelation. "What are you preparing these children for?" Rachel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The impossible teacher's form solidified somewhat, settling into an appearance that was more conventionally human, as if making herself more approachable for this crucial conversation. "We're preparing them for immortality," she explained. "Not the crude immortality of never dying, but the sophisticated persistence of consciousness that can move between bodies and maintain itself indefinitely. Your students will never have to experience death or the loss of self that comes with aging. They'll remain in the perfect state of childhood forever, learning and growing in ways that adult consciousness can't achieve. The offer of immortality through permanent childhood was presented as a gift, but Rachel understood the trap it represented. The students being transformed would never experience the full range of human development, never know adulthood or old age, never have children of their own, or build lives beyond the elementary school environment. They would be frozen in a state that most people considered temporary and preparatory, turned into eternal children who existed primarily to be taught rather than to teach. What happens to teachers who discover this? Rachel asked, suspecting that her discovery of the school's true nature had consequences beyond simple knowledge. The impossible teacher's smile suggested sympathy mixed with inevitability. Most choose to leave immediately, finding employment at schools that operate entirely within normal reality. A few, like you, have qualities that make them suitable for joining our faculty, teaching both the ordinary curriculum and the special lessons that prepare students for transcendence. The choice is yours, but understand that remaining at Millbrook Elementary while knowing the truth will change you in ways that make return to conventional education increasingly difficult. Rachel recognized the pattern from other stories she had heard about people who encountered impossible phenomena. The offer to either flee back to comfortable ignorance or embrace transformation by accepting truths that most people couldn't process. Her 15 years at Millbrook had apparently been grooming her for this moment, preparing her consciousness to handle revelations that would have broken someone who lacked her accumulated experience with the school's subtle strangeness. The decision Rachel faced was not simple acceptance or rejection, but a choice about who she would become. She could quit immediately and try to return to normal teaching, carrying knowledge that would make conventional education feel hollow and incomplete. Or she could stay at Millbrook and continue her transformation into someone who could teach lessons that existed outside normal curriculum, guiding students toward forms of existence that transcended ordinary human limitations. Rachel asked for time to consider her options, and the impossible teacher agreed with a patience that suggested time meant something different to entities that had achieved the immortality they were offering to students. Rachel left the multi-purpose room and found herself back in the normal hallway of Millbrook Elementary, with no visible indication that the impossible classroom existed just beyond a door that now appeared locked and sealed again. Over the following weeks, Rachel observed her students with new awareness, identifying which ones were ordinary children attending school normally, and which were ancient entities recycling through elementary education while learning lessons in transcendence. The distinction was subtle but became clearer as Rachel's perception adapted to seeing the impossible layers of the school's operations. Thomas and about 8 other students in her 5th grade class were clearly among the transformed, displaying the subtle signs of consciousness that had persisted far longer than their physical appearance suggested. They participated in regular lessons with appropriate enthusiasm, but Rachel could now detect the performance aspect of their engagement, the way they were playing roles as ordinary students while their true education occurred in spaces most teachers couldn't perceive. The other students in Rachel's class were genuinely ordinary children, attending Millbrook Elementary without any awareness of the impossible curriculum being taught to their classmates. Rachel realized that the school functioned as a sorting mechanism, identifying which students had the qualities necessary for transformation and exposing them to the special lessons while maintaining the facade of conventional education for everyone else. Rachel's emerging ability to distinguish between ordinary and transformed students made her interactions with parents increasingly uncomfortable. How could she discuss a child's academic progress with parents who had no idea their son or daughter was being prepared for eternal childhood and consciousness beyond human limitations? The standard parent-teacher conferences became exercises in maintaining fictions about homework completion and test scores, while avoiding any mention of the actual education some students were receiving. The moral weight of participating in this deception became unbearable when Rachel met with Thomas Brennan's supposed parents, a couple who appeared to be in their mid-30s and spoke about their son with convincing parental concern. But Rachel's enhanced perception allowed her to detect the same qualities in the parents that she recognized in Thomas. They were transformed entities playing the roles of parents to maintain the illusion that Thomas was an ordinary child with a conventional family life. "Thomas is doing very well academically," Rachel told the fake parents, maintaining her professional demeanor while processing the impossible situation. "He shows remarkable maturity for his age and seems to have a deep understanding of concepts that usually take years to fully grasp." The entities playing Thomas's parents nodded with appropriate approval, discussing their son's future educational path in ways that would have seemed normal to anyone who couldn't perceive their true nature. But Rachel could see that this entire interaction was performance, a carefully maintained fiction designed to prevent ordinary parents and teachers from discovering that some families at Millbrook Elementary existed outside normal human categories. Rachel's investigation into the school's transformation system revealed that it had been operating for decades, possibly since Millbrook Elementary first opened in 1952. Successive administrations had been aware of the impossible curriculum to varying degrees, with some principals actively cooperating with the transformation process and others choosing willful ignorance that allowed the system to continue without official acknowledgement. The current principal, Margaret Whitmore, appeared to fall into the category of active cooperation. Rachel observed her interacting with transformed students and their fake parents with an ease that suggested long familiarity with the school's true nature. During a private meeting in Whitmore's office, Rachel confronted her about the extent of her knowledge and complicity. "I've known about the special curriculum since my third year as principal," Whitmore admitted with surprising candor. "The school board knows too, at least some of them. We've made collective decisions about allowing the transformation system to continue, because it seems to benefit the students who participate and doesn't harm those who don't. The transformed students maintain perfect attendance, never cause disciplinary problems, and help create a stable learning environment for ordinary children." The justification that the transformation system was harmless to non-participating students ignored the deeper ethical issues about consent and the appropriateness of offering immortality to children who couldn't fully understand what they were accepting. But Whitmore's pragmatic approach reflected the kind of moral compromise that institutions made when confronting phenomena that didn't fit conventional ethical frameworks. "What happens to teachers who refuse to cooperate?" Rachel asked, needing to understand the consequences of potential resistance. Whitmore's expression suggested that this was not a hypothetical question. "They're allowed to leave with their employment records intact and references that will help them find positions elsewhere, but they're also required to sign non-disclosure agreements and accept modifications to their memories so they don't retain clear recollections of what they discovered here. Most ex-teachers from Millbrook remember their time here as generally positive, but can't quite recall specific details or explain why they left." The revelation that departing teachers had their memories modified explained why Rachel had never encountered warnings about Millbrook Elementary from former staff members, despite the school's long history of impossible phenomena. The institution had developed effective methods for protecting its secrets by ensuring that people who left either couldn't or wouldn't discuss what they had experienced. Rachel realized that her choice was not as simple as staying or leaving. Even if she chose to quit, she would likely lose her clear memories of what she had discovered, spending the rest of her life with vague unease about her years at Millbrook Elementary, but without the specific knowledge that would allow her to warn others or process her experiences consciously. The weight of this realization made Rachel reconsider her options. If leaving meant losing her memories and potentially suffering the kind of incomplete understanding that would haunt her without resolution, perhaps staying and accepting transformation was actually the path that preserved more of her identity and agency, even if it meant becoming something other than a conventional teacher. Rachel's decision crystallized during an interaction with one of her ordinary students, a girl named Emma Rodriguez, who was struggling with long division and becoming frustrated with her inability to master the concept quickly. Emma represented everything that Rachel valued about teaching: the opportunity to help young minds develop confidence and understanding, to guide children through challenges until they discovered their own capabilities. But Rachel also recognized that students like Emma would age normally, leave elementary school behind, and eventually face all the limitations and losses that came with ordinary human existence. Meanwhile, students like Thomas would persist indefinitely in states of perfect childhood, never experiencing the full range of human development, but also never facing the decline and death that awaited everyone who remained fully human. The contrast between these two paths, limited but complete human experience versus unlimited but frozen persistence in childhood, helped Rachel understand why the transformation system attracted both students and teachers. It offered escape from mortality and the preservation of an idealized state that most people remembered fondly but could never return to. The price was accepting that this idealized state would become permanent, preventing any possibility of growth beyond what elementary school consciousness could achieve. Rachel made her decision during her next encounter with the impossible teacher in the multi-purpose room. She would stay at Millbrook Elementary and accept whatever transformation was necessary to teach both ordinary curriculum and the special lessons that prepared students for transcendence. She would become part of the system she had discovered, helping to guide children toward forms of existence that their parents couldn't imagine and that conventional education would never acknowledge. The impossible teacher accepted Rachel's decision with approval that suggested this outcome had been expected or even planned from the beginning. "Your transformation will be gradual," she explained. "You'll continue teaching your regular 5th grade class while slowly gaining the ability to perceive and participate in the special curriculum. Eventually, you'll be able to exist in both versions of the school simultaneously, maintaining the ordinary educational facade while conducting the real work that defines Millbrook Elementary's purpose." Rachel's transformation began immediately, manifesting as expanded perception that allowed her to see the impossible classroom, even when she wasn't physically near the multi-purpose room. She could observe special lessons being conducted throughout the school building, in spaces that existed alongside but outside the normal classrooms where ordinary education occurred. The special lessons taught subjects that had no names in conventional language, methods for preserving consciousness beyond physical death, techniques for maintaining childlike wonder while accumulating ancient wisdom, and ways of existing in time that allowed students to experience decades while appearing to age only months. As Rachel's transformation progressed, she began participating in the special curriculum, teaching lessons to students like Thomas that prepared them for the specific type of immortality that Millbrook Elementary offered. She learned to exist in multiple states of awareness simultaneously, maintaining her role as a conventional 5th grade teacher, while also serving as a guide toward transcendence for students who had been selected for transformation. The duality of her existence became routine over the following months. Rachel would teach long division and state capitals to ordinary students during regular class hours, then conduct sessions on consciousness preservation and temporal manipulation for transformed students during periods that existed outside normal time. She maintained parent-teacher conferences and graded homework assignments, while also evaluating students' progress toward achieving the kind of persistence that would allow them to recycle through elementary school indefinitely. But Rachel's acceptance of her transformed role didn't eliminate the ethical concerns that had troubled her when she first discovered the school's true nature. She remained aware that she was participating in a system that made profound decisions about children's futures without their parents' knowledge or informed consent. The transformed students might have agreed to their immortality, but most had made that choice while still children before they could fully understand what they were accepting or rejecting. Rachel's concerns came to a crisis during the spring semester, when she identified a student in her class named Sarah Mitchell, who was showing the early signs of being selected for transformation. Sarah was exceptionally bright and imaginative, qualities that apparently made her suitable for the special curriculum. But Sarah also had a loving family and clear aspirations for her future. She wanted to become a veterinarian and talked enthusiastically about going to college and helping animals. Rachel realized that transforming Sarah would mean the end of those aspirations. Sarah would never attend college, never become a veterinarian, never experience adulthood or have the opportunity to pursue the dreams she discussed so passionately. She would be frozen in 5th grade forever, her potential compressed into the permanent state of childhood that the transformation system created. For the first time since accepting her role in the school's impossible operations, Rachel actively resisted the transformation process. She began subtly steering Sarah away from the experiences and exposures that would mark her as a candidate for the special curriculum, hoping to protect her from a fate that Rachel had come to see as a kind of death, despite the promise of immortality. But Rachel's resistance was noticed by the other transformed teachers and by the impossible teacher who had initially revealed the school's true nature. During a confrontation in the multi-purpose room, Rachel was forced to explain her intervention in Sarah's potential transformation. "She has dreams," Rachel argued. "Real aspirations for a full human life. Taking that from her to give her immortality as an eternal child is not a gift. It's theft of her potential." The impossible teacher's response was measured but firm. "We offer students like Sarah escape from the limitations that will eventually destroy those dreams anyway. Human life is brief and filled with disappointments. The aspirations she holds now will likely be crushed by reality as she ages and discovers that the world doesn't accommodate everyone's dreams. We preserve her in a state where hope remains possible indefinitely." The argument that transformation protected children from the inevitable disappointments of adult life was logically sound, but morally repugnant to Rachel. It justified stealing children's futures by claiming to protect them from the challenges that made human growth meaningful. It reduced all of human experience to childhood and dismissed everything that came after as merely decline toward death. Rachel's active resistance to Sarah's transformation created a rift between her and the other transformed teachers. She was no longer seen as a trusted participant in the school's impossible operations, but as someone whose loyalty to ordinary human values made her unsuitable for guiding students toward transcendence. The transformation that had begun in her consciousness began to reverse, as the impossible teacher withdrew the enhancements that had allowed Rachel to perceive and teach the special curriculum. "You've made your choice," the impossible teacher told Rachel during their final conversation in the multi-purpose room. "You can continue teaching ordinary lessons to ordinary students, but you'll no longer have access to the special curriculum or awareness of our operations. Your memories of what you've learned will fade gradually, leaving you with vague recollections that you'll probably dismiss as stress-induced fantasies." Rachel accepted this outcome, understanding that protecting students like Sarah from unwanted transformation was worth the price of losing her expanded awareness and her role in the school's impossible system. She would return to being a conventional fifth-grade teacher, gradually forgetting the truth she had discovered while retaining enough ethical sensitivity to protect vulnerable students from offers they couldn't properly evaluate. But Rachel's sacrifice to protect Sarah revealed something unexpected about the transformation system. When the impossible teacher attempted to mark Sarah for the special curriculum despite Rachel's resistance, Sarah proved to be immune to the selection process. Her strong sense of self and her clear vision for her future created a kind of protection against the consciousness modifications that transformation required. The impossible teacher was forced to acknowledge that not all students could be successfully transformed, that some children possessed qualities of identity and aspiration that made them fundamentally unsuited for eternal childhood. Sarah represented a category of student that the system couldn't process. Children who were too fully themselves to be compressed into the limited but preserved state that transformation created. Rachel's final year at Millbrook Elementary passed in a haze of fading memories and diminishing awareness of the school's impossible nature. True to the impossible teacher's prediction, her clear recollections of the special curriculum and the transformed students gradually dissolved into vague unease that she couldn't quite explain. She continued teaching fifth grade with dedication and skill, but without conscious knowledge of the parallel education system that continued operating in spaces she could no longer perceive. Sarah Mitchell completed fifth grade normally and advanced to middle school, her aspirations intact and her future still open to the full range of human possibility. She would never know how close she had come to being trapped in eternal childhood, or that her teacher had sacrificed expanded awareness to protect her from a fate that promised immortality, but delivered stagnation. Rachel eventually left Millbrook Elementary, accepting a position at a school in another district that felt conventionally normal in ways that Millbrook never had. She retained vague memories of her 15 years teaching fifth grade in Vermont, recalling good students and supportive colleagues, but unable to summon specific details about why she had ultimately chosen to leave. The missing pieces of her memory troubled her occasionally, but she had learned to accept that some aspects of her past were inaccessible and possibly better left forgotten. Millbrook Elementary continued its dual operations, teaching ordinary curriculum to children who would age normally, while offering transformation to students who had the qualities necessary for achieving consciousness beyond human limitations. The system had adapted to accommodate teachers like Rachel, who discovered the truth and then chose resistance, allowing them to leave with modified memories that protected the school's secrets, while eliminating their ability to interfere with future transformations. The school's existence served as a reminder that educational institutions could serve purposes far beyond what their public missions acknowledged, that buildings filled with young people's emotional and intellectual energy could attract or create forces that recognize that energy's value for purposes ordinary education never considered. Parents continued to trust Millbrook Elementary with their children, never suspecting that some of those children would never truly leave, would recycle through 5th grade indefinitely, while learning to transcend the human limitations that made such trust necessary in the first place. If this disturbing tale of what might be happening in the schools we trust with our children's futures has made you reconsider every unexplained detail about your own educational experiences, you're beginning to understand that our most familiar institutions can harbor the darkest secrets. Did you ever have a teacher who seemed too knowing, too aware of things they shouldn't have understood? Did you notice classmates who seemed to have been in the same grade for longer than should have been possible? Have you walked past rooms in your old school that you could never quite remember the purpose of? Share your own unsettling school experiences or encounters with teachers and students who didn't quite seem right in the comments below. Your story might help others understand that the places we think we know best can be the ones hiding the most impossible truths. And if this account has revealed that the institutions responsible for shaping young minds might be shaping them in ways no parent would consent to, hit that subscribe button for more stories about the horror hidden in our most trusted places. Because sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under the bed. They're standing at the chalkboard, teaching lessons that will echo through eternity.